could join us. We're so happy that you could join us for this webinar. Congratulations to all of you for being selected from a pool of 589 applicants. This webinar is brought to you by FinMark Trust. My name is Khomotso Tolamo. I am the country manager for Botswana and Malawi, and I will be moderating today's webinar. FinMark Trust launched the SADC Innovation and Investment Challenge to try to lay the foundation on which to develop an enabling innovation ecosystem that supports the design of products and services that meets the needs of underserved and unserved individuals. We anticipate that the solutions developed through this innovation challenge will catalyze the development of scalable digital products and services that increase the availability of meaningful employment opportunities, particular to vulnerable groups such as women and children and youth, improve access to and usage to basic services, and lead to a more inclusive and responsible financial sector. The SADC Innovation Challenge involves 178 participants from 7 countries across the SADC region, namely South Africa, Malawi, Zambia, Mozambique, Lesotho, Botswana, and Tanzania. The challenge aims to support early tech-enabled innovations that support 4 key development challenges that we are facing in the region. Those are SME finance, digital financial identity, women in savings, specifically digitizing savings groups, access to basic services. Today's webinar focuses on how to leverage technology to develop products and services across the 4 thematic areas. Our first speaker is Bongani Sithole. Bongani is the Chief Technology Officer at Founders Factory Africa. He's a tech entrepreneur, and over the past 17 years, he has built 3 technology businesses from the ground up. He's a strategic thinker in bridging the gap between business needs and technology, and thus helping brands to grow their competitive advantage in the market. He has worked with some big brands across the continent, like Standard Bank, MTN, and BMW. He now helps entrepreneurs and startups to structure their product offering for scale and global positioning. After Bongani's presentation, we will delve into a case study from a South African tech company. Thapelo and Xolisani from Bohlale AI Solutions. Bohlale is an artificial intelligence company that aims to increase the application of AI systems in South Africa. Bohlale believes that artificial intelligence has the potential to change and help many people's lives. They are currently developing a number of systems to improve people's interaction with technology. One of their most exciting projects is a multilingual chatbot named Naledi. We will close the webinar with a Q&A session from our presenters. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. We will try to address as many of these questions as possible within the time that's available. Please feel free to ask your questions as the speakers engage. You don't have to wait for the webinar to come to an end. So over to you, Bongani. Please let me know if you'd like me to share your presentation or whether you'd be sharing from your side.
Thank you very much, Khomotso. You can show on your side if that's okay. Can you hear me?
Hello, Bongani.
Yes, hi, can you hear me? Khomotso? Khomotso, can you hear me? Khomotso, it seems like people can hear me. Can you share on your side? Cool, it seems like everyone can hear me. If it's okay, I'll just share screen on my side so that we can continue. So I'll just try and share on my side and we can start. Great. Can everyone see my screen? Can I just see by notes if you guys can see my screen so we can start? Great. Cool. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining this webinar. It's great to be here. As Khomoso warm welcomed me to this webinar. My name is Bongani Sitole. I love technology. I love entrepreneurship. Originally from here in South Africa, and I've worked with many startups over the last couple of years. I've built a couple of businesses myself. Really interesting times to be in Africa and exciting as well. To that end, I think for me, the interesting part is really, looking at the growth of the entrepreneurship market and how many people are actually thriving in this, tough times, and really building solutions that are specific to the market in South Africa, and specifically Southern, SADC region. So to that end, I would love to start with the presentation just to talk about a couple of things. I think over the last, couple of decades, we've seen quite a lot of change in the market in terms of how we look at what technology is and what it means to the African context, which is really exciting times. And if you look at some of the pictures that I've painted there, it feels like in this day and age, technology is specifically related to the digital era, but technology has really been, how do you actually come up with solutions that can solve, the basic needs of human lives? And if you look at specifically in Africa, there's been so many things that we've been challenged with over the last, couple of years, or maybe even decades, in order for us to deliver services to, basic needs like water and things like that. And the question really is, what has people done to solve some of these problems? And when we look at some of the things that we have done over the last couple of decades, we've asked ourselves a question as to what is technology and how can it actually enable us to move forward? Africa has really been looked at a very fragmented continent with very subtle nuances between markets. If you look at what's happening in the southern region, you look at East Africa and West Africa, the way in which we approach problems and how we go about it is really, really different, purely because of we've got different challenges and problems in those markets. And the question then really is what technology and how is it changing our lives in an African context? And there's a couple of things, right, that I have seen over the last couple of years. One, technology is, it helps us to change that narrative, right? That Africa is really a fragmented market. We don't know how to solve our problems, right? We are a consumer mentality type of continent, right? We're looking for solutions that are coming from the East and the West. But really, technology has been that key driver for us to start to look at our markets, our economy at a different lens. And that's helping us to change our narrative, right? If you look at simple things like, electricity challenges, which has really been a blocker to growth to many African entrepreneurs and businesses in general. The question is how do you solve for that, right? And there's many startups in the last decade that have really, jumped into this problem to figure out how we solve them. If you look at just the financial market, how do we ensure that there's inclusion to people in the rural areas, people who are so far away from, where the hub of the economies are within these, countries. And technology becomes that driver for us, right? And it's really about people who are willing to solve these problems in order to move the country forward, right? And the second thing is, because of we are very fragmented in nature from very early stage, technology is now starting to allow us to actually treat different countries as if we are close to each other, because of connectivity, and we can start to look at collaboration, right, without necessarily being in the same country, right? And we're starting to see a lot of startups starting to merge solutions in trying to solve problems. And I think the other thing is that what I've seen, because of there's a lot of challenges in these countries, one of the problems is that you find an entrepreneur who's trying to come up with a solution, but the challenge becomes that in their respective country or wherever they're operating, the ecosystem around that is not enabling them to thrive as quickly as possible. And you end up having to figure out, like, how do you solve these challenges around your product, right, or your business, right? And the exciting part is, with the growth of technology, we're starting to see entrepreneurs leveraging, sort of like working together in building solutions, as opposed to trying to solve the entire ecosystem. Because previously, as an entrepreneur, when you're trying to solve for a small problem, you figure out, like, you probably need to deliver goods from point A to point B, but that's not your primary business, right? Your business is to maybe build products. At the end of that, someone needs to deliver your product from point A to point B. But they then quickly realize that the market is so fragmented in such a way that there is no delivery system that you can plug into that would allow your business to actually thrive. So you are actually tempted to solve the last mile delivery as well, but that is not actually your primary business, right? And I think with entrepreneurship and the problems that people are trying to solve, and what we are seeing in the SADC region, we are starting to see a lot of collaboration, which is actually helping entrepreneurs to only solve the problem that they've identified and not solving the problem of the ecosystem, right? So that they can be able to thrive. And I think, like, lastly, on the left-hand side, it's about possibilities, right? Technology, it's an enabler. And I think it's really about how an entrepreneur thinks about the problem that they're facing and how they can go about it, right? The possibilities are limitless because of there's many ways to basically solve the problem. And innovation, basically, when you talk about it, or specifically technology, it's not really about thinking of, big software tools and, you really just need to think about how can you actually solve small problems to enable you to get to the next level. Simplicity is one of those things that enables businesses that thrive. And I think globally, if you can look at your Airbnb, you look at Uber, you look at Facebook, these businesses are actually solving, they started by, like, solving small problems, and they were specific, right? And when you look at how much they have done to date, and you look at the problem that they were solving, it was a simple problem, right? But it has changed the economy. It has changed how people do things, which is really great. And I think, like, in an African context, that's really sort of the lens that we need to look at, in terms of, like, how do we actually look at a problem in a very simplistic way and try to solve, for what we have seen. Now, coming to the next, slide, I think what we really need to look at is, what are the gaps in our market, right? What can we solve for? I think what I've seen, at least in the last 10 years, many entrepreneurs are faced with a lot of shining things in front of them, right? When they start to think about technology, if you look at the likes of, AI, if you think about blockchain and things like that, it's a lot of shiny things that are tempting, and many people, they realize the challenges that are faced, their countries are facing, and equally they're tempted to apply all of these new technologies, right, into solving these problems. And what I've realized is that many businesses that have really done well, particularly in Africa, it's really not following these big trends and just understanding what you're trying to solve for, And number two is, do you have the skill set to solve for the problem that you have identified? And number three is, how do you then, take the gaps and the skills and innovate around that, right? So that you can be able to move the needle forward. And it's really just about doing small things as opposed to taking too long. So the other thing is, from a technology standpoint, is I've realized that because of you are tempted to apply a lot of technological solutions in your approach, it eventually takes you like a year or 2 years trying to come up with a simple solution, right? And technology is really, it's really just an enabler, but how you go about it, it's what matters, right? Combining simple things that are available on the market in order for us to solve the challenges that Africa is facing. And the question is like, really, what is innovation, right? And I think for me, what I've really seen and what I believe is that simplicity is the absolute complication, right? So what it means is that you end up building a huge, complicated business through simplicity. If you, going back to my examples, Facebook, when they started, they just wanted to connect people in the university, right? It was a simple approach. But when you look at it now, it's a really complicated business, right? If you look at the likes of Uber, they just, they were just solving a simple problem just for the city. But if you now look at where they are, they've grown so much across different markets. And the problem is that when you start at the end, which is complication, you'll definitely never end up on the simplicity side, because it's difficult to break down complication to its bare simplicity. But if you start simple, eventually the market will guide you in terms of where you need to go. You eventually end up building this complicated business, but it's working, right? And I think my point with this is, as African entrepreneurs, if we can understand that simplicity is actually what helps us, right? It's really what will help us to thrive in this African economy. We will have a better lens of how we can solve our problems. And the reason why simplicity is important is purely because of, we don't have, tools. If we look at the infrastructure in Africa, it's really challenging, right? And if you then take a simple approach in solving a problem, it'll help you to go a long way, right? And the other thing is that when you actually taking a simpler approach to solving problems, you're getting quite a lot of feedback quite quickly, because of you are taking technology and you are innovating and you're putting in front of users' hands as quickly as possible for you to get feedback and be guided by the market in terms of where you need to go, right? So you innovate as you go, because sometimes you can be tempted that you understand the market quite well, you understand technology, you understand what you're doing, particularly if you come from a background of being a technical person in your career. You are tempted to come up with a complicated solution for the problem that you're facing. So the best way to go about it, and from many businesses that I've seen and what I've built myself, when you take a simple approach to solving problem, you go a long way, right? And you get a lot of people to support you on the journey. I've been thinking about, like, how do you innovate in a financial inclusion gap? The financial sector is actually not a vertical. It's not a vertical in its own right. It is a pillar that supports all the industries. If you think about it, whether you think about education, whether you're thinking about financial markets, you're thinking about health sectors, and so on and so forth. The financial, sector is a pillar to all of these things. And the question really is, how do we actually build simple, solution in a financial sector that enables the market across different areas? If you think about healthcare, if you think about, banking, if you think about mobility as an example, there is no way that, any of those industries that don't speak to financial services. And if that is the answer to, to the basis of how we can innovate and bring everyone included in the transactions that, you know, each market or each vertical might have, and financial services become that pillar. The question is, how do you then innovate in that space, right? To make sure that the people that have never been in that sort of like space before, they can now get an opportunity to be able to partake in the value chain, right? And I think that is really what we are talking about today, to say all the industries, the basis of that is really around the financial services sector, right? And we really need to figure out, like, how do we actually help people who are in the remote areas, who can help us to be able to innovate with them and basically get them through this value chain process. And I think in you going through the process of innovating, you need to look at the lens of the financial services sector is an enabler across all different areas. It could be banking, could be whatever. Financial services sector is important. And historically, you probably know that in Africa, we are unable to partake in the economy on a basis that we do not have ways to participate in the economy on a basis that we are excluded, right? And the innovation that we are trying to come up with is, how do we enable those people? Coming back to my previous slide, simplicity is the answer to how you think about your solution and how you can innovate to bring people into these economies. And I can give multiple examples, right? I mean, there's businesses that have taken solar powers and democratizing access to electricity, right? And enabling people in rural areas to say, how can we enable people to have electricity by paying less, right? And it's one of the solutions that you can then look at and say, how do we innovate around that space, right? Another thing is, how do you enable people to participate in the landscape of financial services without a bank account, right? How do you do that? And it's coming up with simple solutions, looking at what is available, in your market to be able to give people access to the financial services sector. Moving along to the next, and you guys can ask questions as we go if you've got questions. So the next slide is really about, how do we approach innovation, right? I've actually put this slide in because, what I've realized is entrepreneurs sit in the middle of all of these challenges, right? Healthcare, wearables, medical devices, and so on and so forth. And they have access to all of these things. And the question for them is, how do they actually take all of these things and consider them to build solutions, right? And the answer to that is, don't look at the latest and greatest technology, to be honest, because adoption for that, in most cases, it takes slightly longer. It is really how you look at what is available on the market that you are trying to solve for, as opposed to what available technology is out there. Because you can build these greatest tools, greatest technologies, etc., but the adoption of it based on the market that you're operating within, you then struggle with adoption, right? So there's a lot of enablers that you can look into, but the reality is that the market that you're operating within should be the driver for you in terms of how you go about it, right? And when you want to solve for healthcare challenges, if you want to solve for financial services sector, the question is, what does the market have that you can utilize as quickly as possible? And you can pivot your business as you go, right? You can pivot your product as you go. The most important thing is really thinking about how do you take the smallest to enable the biggest, right? So meaning that you're taking something like a USSD application that will help you interact with a different service provider, for example. But the USSD is something that is available on, whether you're in a rural area or wherever you are, you could be able to reach, you could actually be able to match markets, right? So the point is, use the simplest, for you to be able to match the two markets. Moving along in the same path of like, how do you approach innovation? So there's a question here. The question is, what is the impact of financial inclusion, right? So the impact of that, it's actually a good question. And maybe before I answer your question, is if you think about how the economies across different countries in Africa operate, and I can give an example right here in Johannesburg in South Africa. You find that there's a lot of economic activities in the city, but a lot of people are outside the city, right? And those people, they don't have access to the same luxuries that we have in Johannesburg, as an example, right? And the question is, if you want to grow the economy in South Africa, for example, where a majority of people are outside the city, then the question is, how do you bring them along, right? And you are left with a couple of solutions. One is the government needs to come up with a solution. And I'm sure everyone on the call would definitely agree that the government has failed quite a lot of African countries, including people in the rural areas or people outside the city in the economic transactions, right? So you are then left with the people on the ground who are seeing these problems every day, right? In terms of how can they be able to pull people outside the city to be able to participate without them being in the same parts of the country as the rest, as the rest of the people, right? And that's where innovation comes in, right? Then innovation basically bridges the two markets, right? And then you are including people in the financial transactions that are going on in the city while they're not in the city, right? And that's what we are talking about when we're saying what will the financial inclusion or the impact of financial inclusion be? What it means is that you will have people who are now all of a sudden able to participate in the market without being in in the same vicinity as everyone else. But the tools with which the entrepreneurs would be coming through, would be building, would enable them to be able to participate. And now that they can, participate in the economy, you are inherently increasing the economy and helping, the rural areas and innovating around things that they could not have, have access to previously. So if you look at the first block on the left-hand side, where I say solutions to grant access to previous things we couldn't access. What it means is that you are saying to people who have never have access to a bank account, or access to electricity, or access to water, or things like that, you are saying that as an entrepreneur, I'm going to come up with a solution, right? That can help us to bridge the divide, right? And we are going to build solutions that will bring people closer to where the economic activities are. And number two is that how does my solution help change the narrative, right? So if you are building a solution that, as an example, you are enabling people to get access to medication, right? Whether it's through drone delivery or some sort of a way where they can get access to healthcare through your solution. Again, what you are doing is that you are including people in financial activities that they've never had an opportunity before to be part of, right? You are now changing the narrative of people who were not able to access these economies before. And number three is that your solution, the question that you should be asking yourself is, can my solution be part of a bigger ecosystem? If you remember, what I opened up with was generally in Africa, because of the lack of infrastructure that we have, we then have a challenge of, as an entrepreneur, you get tempted to solve for too much as opposed to solving for a specific item that you wanted to work on. And the reason why is because of we don't have enough solutions on the ecosystem to plug into, right? If you look at the economy in the US and other countries, the startup economy is so matured. There's a lot of APIs, there's a lot of products that when you're solving for a specific problem, you can just plug into APIs and you get your solution to the market as quickly as possible, right? So my point with this blog is to say that every time when you think about technology in the context of Africa, ask yourself a question that, can I build a product that can add value in the bigger ecosystem, right? Can you build a platform that will enable other players to plug into your platform to be able to grow their products without solving for what you are doing, right? So have that sort of like ecosystem mindset so that you can grow the economy or the ecosystem around you. So that if people are thinking about credit card transactions or POS systems or whatever case might be, you become top of mind, right? Because of you've built your solution for the bigger ecosystem, so people can leverage you and they can plug into what you're doing. Number 4 is how do we leverage the market, right? So this is basically a question that says, if you look at the market where you're operating, what are those levers that are available to you immediately that you can use, right? Part of the challenge is that most entrepreneurs, they look outside where they are when they can actually utilize what's closest to them to basically start to build a solution, right? It is important for you to leverage what is next to you so that you don't use a lot of money to test out your product or to test out your solution, right? So you should be able to leverage whatever that is available to you to test out your model, to test out your hypothesis, to be able to get to the next level before you even worry about expansion or anything like that. Just use the group around you, or rather leverage the market for you to be able to deliver solutions. I just want to read out the question here that I'm seeing, or maybe it's a comment. In some places, you may find that not only women that form groups or social funding investments. Okay, so I guess maybe that is a comment more than a question. Okay, cool. So again, like, in fact, to that last point, if you look at what's happening, in townships and in rural areas, again, like, you find all of these groups that are available to you as an entrepreneurs that are trying to either save money in one form or the other, or they're trying to solve a particular problem for their own small community and so on and so forth. And I'd really advise you guys as entrepreneurs that leverage those groups as much as you can in building a solution. And in fact, those people become, a catalyst for your product, right? In terms of how you can move to the next community, or how you move to the next township and so on and so forth. So if you leverage that, it will help you quite a lot in terms of how you utilize these schemes in building your product. The next slide is when you think about building solutions, what I've seen works quite well. It's not taking a linear approach, right, in using technology and innovation to solve problems. One is typically what would happen is you'd identify a problem. And as a second step is, instead of taking a narrow view on that particular problem, you need to widen your scope, right? So that you can get as much information as possible. So for example, if there are multiple, groups of women or groups of people in a township trying to save money or whatever, forming investment schemes and so on and so forth, your question should be like, how do you widen the problem that you have identified, right? How do you speak to multiple communities about the problem that you have identified? And funny enough, you'd realize that, like, there's different communities and groups, they take different approaches in how they think about investments, in how they think about, like, access to health, and so on and so forth, right? And when you widen your scope of the problem that you have identified, it helps you to come up with an informed hypothesis of exactly what you need to be solving for, right? And hence that is why I'm saying, like, don't take a narrow view of what you've just identified and go forward, but really open it up to the market so that you can widen your, you can get a lot of information to form a specific hypothesis. Coming out of that, you then go narrow. Because of you've got multiple options, you can start to pick in, you know, specific points within that particular, you know, a particular, you know, market that you are looking into. You start to narrow down, right? And what you'd realize is that where you started by identifying a problem, and when you start to narrow down your problem, you'll start to realize that what you've identified in the beginning and the reality on the ground starts to be different, right? And what I've seen is that most businesses, you know, particularly early stage businesses, they fail on a basis that they don't go wide and narrow, right? They just go linear, right? So if you widen your lens and then you narrow down, the process of narrowing down, it starts to inform you as to, like, what are the user needs and how can you go about it? In fact, in most cases, you can even start to build what we call, you know, customer advisory board, right? Where you have like few people within these groups that they can start to inform you about their processes, right? So that they can inform your build process when you think about building a product. And once you start to narrow down, again, you go a little bit wider, right? Where you can say, how do I take multiple solutions and merge them into a problem, right? And on the merging ideas is, you've went to like multiple communities, you've realized their financial struggle, you've realized how they're trying to solve for health, education, water, etc. And you start to look at these ideas and you start to merge them, right? And when you start to merge them, that's when you start to realize that where you started and where you are and the reality on the ground is different. And this will inform what we call a solution fit, right? Most people, before you even worry about what you call a product market fit from a technology and innovation point of view, and this is even before you start to build anything as an entrepreneur, right? These are the testing that you do on the market to match the available technology, and you innovate through the challenges that you see on the ground to get to a point where you have a problem solution fit, right? And the problem solution fit is a narrative that basically says that I have looked at the available technology in the market that I'm dealing with. I've identified the problem. I've gone wide to see the challenges in different lenses. I've narrowed down. I came up with hypotheses and I've made ideas, and this is what I think I want to go forward with as a, you know, problem solution fit before you even start to build your product. And the question really is, what is innovation, right? Innovation is really, again, like identifying gaps, right, on the market and looking at the technology that is available to enable you to solve the gaps that you have identified. And lastly is introducing what users did not know was possible, right? So innovation is really taking all of these things and introducing something new to the market, right? And new, I don't mean coming up with another Uber or another Airbnb or whatever case might be. It could really be something like, my community doesn't have access to water, right? How do I enable them to be able to have access to water? They don't know, they don't have access to an ATM. How do I enable them? They don't have bank accounts because of traveling from where they are to, you know, to town in order for them to open up a bank account. It's something that is just not possible, right? How do I use technology to bring something new to my economy, to my available market in terms of solving a problem, right? And technology becoming that enabler. And when I think about technology, it could be available software that is on the market. It could be APIs that you could integrate to. It could be anything, right? But from where I started, make sure that when you build a business, take a lens of simplicity, right? Use whatever that is available. You can grow your business as you go, or you can pivot as and when it is needed. But the simplicity is that identify the gaps, narrow down, build hypothesis, look for technology that can enable that, and then bring a new solution to the market. And to that end, that's me. I would love to answer questions, specifically to people who have ideas, or maybe how you think about innovation and how you would love to enable your market in whatever that you're trying to solve for. I'm happy to answer questions, to guide you in terms of what are the options that you can take in innovating in your specific area or market. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bongani. That was an incredible presentation, a very thorough presentation, and we have questions streaming in. I am just going to take 2 or 3, considering time, but to all the participants of the webinar, the webinar and the presentation will be available on the SADC Innovation website, so it will be available for download there. And Bongani is also one of the mentors that will be supporting you throughout the competition. So he will also be available via the Slack channel, where you can engage with him one-on-one on your specific solution. So if I don't get to your question, you will still have another opportunity to engage with him after this. Bongani, there was one interesting question from Clifford. Clifford is from Malawi, and he speaks about just the cost of starting up a tech business. He says that in Malawi, for a fintech company, you're required to pay the equivalent of up to $50,000 US, and that is a very, very high amount, considering that you're a startup and you're operating in a sector that many people are still getting accustomed to. Are you able to just speak to just the cost of starting up and how young innovators can probably innovate around the cost, being able to find a balance there?
Yeah, sure. That's really an interesting question. I think, I would have loved to just get context of that question from a perspective of when he talks about cost. Is it like registration of a business, right? Being that business operating in a financial services sector, or is it registering your business with a financial services board, or what is the question? Because if you look at a couple of countries, there is a challenge of cost around you start a financial services business and you are eventually required to register yourself as a financial services provider, right? And if that is the question, that is actually a challenge across many countries, right? Where you are trying to provide a simple solution, but you are required to become a financial services provider, and that the cost for that can be quite high. And what I've seen on the market, if that is your question, what I've seen on the market is many entrepreneurs, they would come up with a solution and work with an existing financial services provider, right? So that they can ride behind their certificate, if I can call it that, right? So you are providing a service through someone who's already an existing service provider on the market to avoid the cost, right? And the way in which you go about it would be, some sort of a JV agreement with that particular service provider, so that you can use their license to be able to provide a service, right? And at a later stage, you could then figure out how do you then spin out once your business has worked. There's many ways from a legal standpoint that you can go about in solving that specific problem. I'm hoping that I'm answering the right question, but if that's it, if that is the question, that's how many people are going about it. You don't have to necessarily, cover the cost yourself in the beginning. You just have to be innovative around how you go around the legal structures of getting that up.
Thank you, Bongani. That was the response I believe that he was looking for. One last question, then I'm going to hand over to the Bohlale team. How does one innovate in technology if you're not a tech person?
Khomoto?
Hi, did you hear my question?
Khomoto, I think we're still waiting for Botlali to connect.
Okay.
While you're waiting for them, there's an interesting question here that I'd love to answer.
Perfect, go ahead.
The question is, what do you think on outsourcing a service from competitors when you are just starting up? And that is actually an interesting question, and I'd love to answer that in multiple ways. What I've seen is that if you want your business to fail as quickly as possible, is outsourcing the core of your business, right? If you are building some sort of an IP as a startup, however expensive that can be, never send or at least use services of a competitor, right? Because of you going to lose an advantage in the market. The other thing is that whenever you are building a business, there's multiple things that you need to look at. If there are pieces of work or software that can be built that are not IP specific, you can outsource that to multiple parties. The best thing that you need to do is get a technologist in your business who can then be able to take or rather manage all of the service providers that are building source code for you, who can then be able to take all of that and build it up to build your IP, right? When it comes to outsourcing, outsource things that are not specific to the IP of your business. You can leverage services from competitors, but never your IP of your business, because otherwise you don't have an advantage in your business after you've leveraged those services, right? And the other thing is, if you're planning to collaborate with them, you need to make sure that you guys have signed NDAs and things like that in co-working or co-building in solving the problem. You could potentially be able to do that with them.
Thank you, Bongani. Thapelo, are you ready on your side? You can share your screen so long, or do you need another minute?
Hi, Khomoto. We're ready to start.
Okay, perfect. You can share your screen.
Okay. All right. Can everyone see the screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, thanks. Good afternoon. And yeah, thanks for having us. So I'm Thapelo, one of the co-founders of Botlali AI Solutions. And I'll essentially be taking you through our story on how we went about innovating around financial inclusion, but more specifically, our product, which deals with access to financial services. So I'll basically just be telling you our story, and I guess there are certain things people can pick up from our story. Yeah. So for those of you who don't know or haven't heard about Botlali AI, we are a Cape Town-based research and innovation startup that specializes in vernacular conversational AI systems. And we envision Africa's complex and unique problems being solved innovatively by Africans through the use of artificial intelligence. So that's what drives us. And as a research and innovation startup, we spent a lot of time looking at global trends in natural language processing, and our research kept pointing us to an anticipated growth spurt of conversational AI systems, or AI systems within numerous industries. And the issue we saw here was that this growth spurt was for systems that were only in English and other major global languages. And this meant that people who speak other languages will lose out on the potential of using these conversational AI systems to improve their lives, and especially in Africa, because these systems can be used for various applications like reading to the blind, transcribing for the deaf, teaching people how to speak new languages, simplifying digital interactions. And the list goes on. These systems are being used for a lot of applications around the world. So it was at this point that we started building Naledi. So you can think of Naledi as Siri, but for South African languages. But Naledi is essentially a collection of human language technology tools for South African languages to help people interact with service providers through digital platforms. And the idea and thought process here is similar to what Bongani was saying just now about how we need to start building solutions that will allow innovators to plug into in order to develop other solutions. And that's what we're doing in the human language technology space for African languages. And we didn't necessarily build Naledi for the financial space, but for various applications such as the ones I mentioned earlier on. However, during the time that we started building, major retail banks in South Africa were deep within the process of going digital and closing down a lot of their physical branches. And we picked up like a major practical issue at this point, because the digital services that these banks were offering were only in English. And it is likely that non-English speaking people will have difficulty interacting with their banks using these channels, in a language that they do not thoroughly comprehend, in a language that they do not trust. When people are dealing with money, they need to deal with money in ways that they trust, in ways that they feel comfortable. And there was an investigation at the University of Pretoria's Gordon Institute of Business, which was kind of backing our thinking. And this investigation basically pointed out that financial language is one of the major contributing factors to financial exclusion. And this is something that's true, and this is something that we grew up seeing around us. This is something that we see around us in our daily lives. So if for instance, you've got someone, let's say Jabu, who was born into a Zulu-speaking home, and unlike John, he doesn't have a bank account, and even if he did, he wouldn't have any idea what the word beneficiary means or what an authorization is, right? He wouldn't know what a two-step verification process is. And the issue here is with the terms, because these terms might seem obvious to some people, but to the average South African, these terms are foreign. And then we looked at South Africa and we realized that Jabu is not the only person facing this issue, because he's one of millions of South Africans who've been excluded from the formal economy because only 8% of the population speak English at home. So it was very clear to us that in South Africa, English is the primary language of instruction and trade, not the primary language of understanding. So this was a practical pain point or it still is a practical pain point that many South Africans have to deal with on a daily basis. And Naledi is essentially our innovative way of dealing with that problem, the problem of access to financial services. Okay, cool. So we did this research, we thought about this, and now, we get to a point where we're like, okay, so what do we do? How do we go about this? How do we make people speak to computers? How do we make computers understand what people are saying? What's machine learning? What's deep learning? And, we were fortunate enough to be at a place with a solid internet connection. So we spent about 6 solid weeks of just learning the necessary skills that we would need to build a system. And I mean, we have an engineering background, so that was also pretty helpful. But we worked every day from 9 a.m. till 10 p.m. for 6 solid weeks. And, you know, at that time we were, TensorFlow had just released their JavaScript library, and we were one of the first people to play with it. And, you know, the hours we spent there, we weren't, you know, we didn't really see how valuable they would be in the future. But obviously, you know, being in a developing country, skills are not the only thing that get in the way. You know, there are many other hurdles that we have to overcome strategically. And specifically for us, one of the major issues was, because we're in deep learning, was access to sufficient data and computing resources to train the machine learning models that we've been building. And, you know, similar to what Bongani was saying earlier on, we also found ourselves in an ecosystem that was under-resourced. You know, so South Africa is very under-resourced in terms of language data that's necessary for the systems we're trying to build. Just to give you an idea, the biggest language data set for any South African language, the biggest speech data set for any South African language is about 56 hours, whereas languages like English, Mandarin are at around 10,000 hours. So this is a major hurdle that we're busy overcoming. And also, you know, deep learning needs a lot of computational resources, which is quite expensive, you know, as someone who's trying to start out and basically build a solution. But apart from the technical aspect of our business, we needed access to experienced industry experts to help us navigate this new and unfamiliar playing field that we found ourselves in. Like I said, we came from a very technical background, so we needed guidance in that sense. And one thing that really worked for us in this regard was tapping into Cape Town's tech startup ecosystem, which gave us the opportunity to present and showcase our ideas on various platforms. And pitching events are very helpful. Pitching events are very helpful in particular because they give entrepreneurs a chance to showcase their idea in front of experienced panelists and judges. And these judges will usually give like very valuable constructive feedback. And I mean, in our experience, we gained a lot more from networking at these events than from the competition prizes themselves, because, you know, networking and being in touch with these mentors has really been helpful. You know, it was through the networking from the competitions that we managed to deal with a lot of the challenges that I mentioned earlier on. And as a result of the competition, you know, we got invited to do a number of radio and TV interviews, which caught the attention of people we had initially been trying to contact, people who were initially ignoring our emails. And, you know, we managed to start forming partnerships that we wanted through these platforms, because it was through these platforms and exposure that people actually started listening, because initially they were like, you know, who's this person trying to email me? And I think that's a challenge that a lot of startups have at a very early stage, when you're still at an idea, when you're thinking about what you're trying to do. So going out to these pitching events is really helpful. Sometimes you don't hear what you want to hear, but it actually helps your thinking and your business in the long run. But yeah, so that's basically our journey up to this point. And I think the key takeaways from our experience, you know, is to take full advantage of free online resources, because I mean, we learn an A if so of secondly to local to basically give you constructive feedback, to break your idea apart, and for you to basically go back and think about your idea properly. And I think, yeah, the last point is one of the most important ones, building a solid network of mentors and industry experts, because I mean, a lot of us just come up with an idea with little to no experience within the space that we want to go into. So having someone help you through that journey is very valuable. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Thapelo. That was a wonderful presentation, and I think it's clarified and spelled out your journey very well. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so we won't be able to take the questions that you have. But because you're participants in this challenge, you have access to the Slack channel. Please join the Slack channel. Please use that platform. Ask as many questions as you need asked. As I mentioned, there's opportunity for one-on-one engagement with the mentors. So please leverage that. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier as well, the presentation will be available on the SADC Innovation Competition website. Follow the hashtag on social media for more information. We'll be having these webinars frequently, so please do keep your eyes on social media for more information on that. And also just some competition related practical questions. You will hear from each hub from your individual countries regarding the boot camps. I know there are quite a few concerns about the coronavirus and how it will impact the boot camps. You will receive further information about that from your hubs in country. And you will also receive further information about the webinar links and further support that you will be provided throughout the competition. I hope that this has been inspiring. I hope that it has given you a great starting point, and I hope that it has helped you to think more broadly about what's possible and the various ways that you can leverage this channel for the end goal of your individual companies. Wishing you all the best and have a good evening. Bye.